One and all. Thank you so much for joining us today for this fantastic webinar from the Accelerating Innovation for Mothers AIM team. My name is Professor Joshua Vogel. I am the Co-Program Director for Maternal, Child and Adolescent Health at the Burnet Institute in Melbourne and one of the collaborators on the AIM project. AIM is a large international research project looking at the innovations in the major causes of maternal and perinatal morbidity and mortality. And I want to just thank and acknowledge the Concept Foundation and Policy Cures Research, who have also been working on this exciting area of work, which is very kindly supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We have a wonderful session today, the next in a series of webinars we've been running over the last several months. Today is Diagnosis in the Dark. We'll be talking about research and development, cutting-edge innovations in the space of prediction and diagnosis of pre-eclampsia. The format for today, we're going to start with a brief technical presentation from my colleague, Dr. Ventola, who I'll shortly introduce. And then we will introduce our three panelists who have very kindly joined us today for some Q&A. A bit of housekeeping. We are recording this session, which will be conducted entirely in English. The recording will be available online for all to watch. You can access that after the session via the Concept Foundation website and their YouTube channel. And we'd be very happy to take any questions or comments that people may have via the Q&A function on your Teams platform, which you should be able to access easily. So with that, I will just start by introducing Dr. Cecile Ventola. Cecile comes with a PhD in public health from University of Paris, and she is a senior technical officer for sexual and reproductive health at Policy Cures Research. And Cecile and her team have been leading the development of research and development pipelines within the AIM project. And today, Cecile is going to be speaking on the findings from this very latest of reports on diagnostics for preeclampsia. Thanks very much, Cecile. Over to you.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks for the introduction. So hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the landscape of diagnostic for preeclampsia. And as Josh said, this is a reflection of our pipeline work within the AIM project. Everything I'm going to present is actually part of the report that we published just last month, focusing on diagnostics on 3 maternal health conditions, including preeclampsia. I'm just going to start with a few words on Policy Cures Research. We are a global health research and policy organization, focusing on R&D gaps for global health priorities, so neglected diseases, emerging infectious diseases, and sexual and reproductive health. And we gather data. We're mostly known for our funding data project with the G-Finder, but we also do pipeline data. And we provide this data and analysis to the global health community to try and stimulate efficient funding and coordinated efforts in the global health space. And so within AIM, we do the pipeline work. So a few words about this maternal health pipeline. It covers 7 different maternal health conditions that you can see here on the left, so including preeclampsia, with different product categories from medicines to diagnostics and devices. We've been looking at data from 2000 up until 2023, and we're actually conducting an update right now of the whole pipeline. So our process is data mining from is data mining from different sources. So as you can see here, pharmaceutical databases, clinical trial registries, literature, funders grant databases, and we compile all of this data and scope it line by line, every clinical trial and studies to see what's in scope. And from this information, we then build profiles for each candidate and product with a lot of detailed information. All of that is available on the portal that is linked here. And if you go to the next slide, you can see how it looks like there. So I selected the condition I was interested in, preeclampsia, the product type diagnostic, and then I get a list and I can click on it and get all of this different information. So for example, the development status, our threshold is there sign of activity in the R&D space in the last 3 years? If yes, it's active. If not, it's inactive. The R&D stage, but also the key features here where we describe the product, how it works, and linked all the relevant studies and clinical trials. So all of this is available online. And we can now take a look at what it looks for pre-eclampsia. So first of all, why do we need pre-eclampsia diagnostics? In terms of disease burden, pre-eclampsia affects up to 5% of pregnancies, and it can develop into eclampsia, which is responsible for 1 out of 10 maternal deaths worldwide. There's no cure and very few treatment options. The current criteria, diagnostic criteria we're working with at the moment are new onset hypertension in association with some clinical manifestations, such as proteinuria, signs of maternal organ dysfunction, or uteroplacental dysfunction. So these are all like clinical manifestation of the disease, which are noticeable when it's already progressed quite a bit. And that is relevant for diagnostic because actually the only clinical management tool that we have to try and prevent the development of preeclampsia is prophylactic measures, more precisely the administration of aspirin before 20 weeks of gestation. So we do need diagnostics or screening tools that allow us to actually predict the risk for preeclampsia earlier than clinical manifestations, which we don't have for the moment. We are faced with quite a few challenges when trying to diagnose preeclampsia, mostly our poor understanding of the disease, of its etiology. We are confronted with a large spectrum of signs and symptoms, and the research is starting to show that it could actually, under the umbrella term of preeclampsia, cover distinct pathologies or variants, for example, different causes and pathway for early onset or late onset preeclampsia. So it's difficult to diagnose something that we don't fully understand and we can't fully characterize. So this is one of the main challenges. But this is also where diagnostic research can be very important, because beyond identifying affected women, it can help improve our understanding of the disease by looking at specific biomarkers or pathways or signs of dysfunction, and ultimately actually help therapeutic development. And now to take a look at the pipeline itself. So here you have an overview of what we found. On the left, you have a breakdown of the 76 diagnostics by R&D stage. So early development on the left, late development in the middle, and post-marketing on the right. So as you can see, not a lot of products, only 8 approved diagnostic for preeclampsia. Most of the pipeline is still in development, and actually the majority of it, 85%, is still in early development. That is also reflected by where the research is conducted. So most of it is happening within clinical or academic spaces. And there's still a lot of work to be done to bring this early development diagnostic to the market. And there is a lack of industry involvement that is hindering that progress. That being said, it is quite an active field with 55 of the candidates that are in active development, as opposed to 21 inactive. And that is actually more encouraging than what we tend to see, for example, in drug development. On the right, you have a breakdown of the different approaches and technology used for diagnosing preeclampsia. There is a predominance of biomarkers, as you can see in green, with multi or individual biomarker tests, but also a wide diversity of approaches. And we can dive a bit more into this in the next slide. So first of all, biomarker tests, like I said, it's a very dynamic field with 43% of the candidates. But not only that, the second biggest category is multi-parametric tests, and 81% of them actually also include 1 or more biomarkers, so it's very prevalent. And out of the 8 approved products, 6 are actually biomarker tests, and 1 is a multi-parametric test that includes biomarker, the Fetal Medicine Foundation algorithm. So you have the list of the 6 approved biomarker tests on the right here. So there's a lot happening in this space, and that is also visible through the multiple individual biomarkers that are currently being discovered via omics studies. We came across a lot of these. We did not include them in the analysis or in the profile because it's very upstream discovery research that is still quite far away from the clinic. But as you can see, we found 277 biomarkers, individual ones for preeclampsia, which is quite a lot and shows how much activity and interest there is in the space. And this biomarker omics studies research can also really help contribute to understanding of the pathology, and some of the differentiation, for example, between early onset and late onset preeclampsia is happening in this space. It is very unlikely that we're going to find one single biomarker that will be effective enough to be a diagnostic. This is also shown by the soluble FLT1 biomarker that has been investigated for over 20 years, but hasn't quite made its way to the clinic because it's not specific enough. But it is very likely that a combination of biomarkers could really bring specificity to a diagnostic tool, or a combination with other technologies, which brings us to the next slide and other categories. So I mentioned multi-parametric test already. It's quite an important category, and it's combining biomarkers with medical risk factors, for example, blood pressure or ultrasound measurements. They're often developed into predictive screening tests, which is very interesting in terms of how early people can get screened. And they're also developed into clinical decision support tools, which is important in terms of accessibility and implementation in low resource settings. Imaging is also a quite big category, which is often the case for pregnancy-related conditions, but compared to other conditions like IUGR or PTL, that is kind of less the case for pre-eclampsia. That has to do with the presentation of the disease, and also the fact that imaging then focuses on placental vascularization rather than fetal development or uterine activity, for example. But it's quite a big category still, and also a lot of multiparametric tests actually include some ultrasound measurements. And the last category that we grouped everything else under, it was mostly blood pressure measurements, which reflects the clinical presentation of preeclampsia, of course. But the fact that this category is smaller than the others also shows that it hasn't been the focus of research in the last 20 years, and it is rather shifting towards other measurements. What the diversity that we see is telling us, it's first of all reflecting what I said about the poor understanding of the pathology and the fact that we are developing multiple approaches to try and understand it better. It's also telling us that it's very likely that the diagnostics that will really be helpful are going to be a combination of this different approach and probably a multiparametric test. Next slide, please. This is just the conclusion that we're reaching. So this is a very dynamic field, a nascent but very dynamic field. It's facing dual challenges that are specific to both maternal health and diagnostic development. So like I said, the majority of diagnostics in the pipeline are in early development, and mostly the research is conducted in academic or clinical context, which puts them quite far away from coming to the market. There's a lack of interest from the industry that has to do with a perceived low return on investment that is typical to diagnostic research, but also maternal health research. And also to maternal health research specifically, there's a perception of liability and litigiousness every time there are pregnant people involved in R&D, which hinders the development and the investment of the industry, which might be really essential to actually bring all of this early development diagnostic to the market. So this is needed, and maybe some coordinated efforts in that direction. But there are two reasons to be quite optimistic. As I highlighted already, a very dynamic field of biomarker discovery that has the potential to revolutionize diagnostic and understanding of the pathology, and also pave the way for other maternal health conditions in terms of discovery. And there's also throughout the pipeline already consideration of accessibility issues. So a lot of biomarker tests are being developed into point of care tests that are applicable to low resource settings. I mentioned already clinical decision tools that can help with the interpretation of biomarker and imaging tests, and that are thus implementable in low resource settings as well. So this is really reassuring, as we know that the consequences of preeclampsia and eclampsia are more dire in low resource settings. This is it for me. On the next slide, you have the resources around the AIM pipeline, so the reports that we've published already, including the one on diagnostics, and again, the portal that is accessible with all that data. And I think, Josh, that there's something to plug in about the AIM research that is currently ongoing.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cecile. A really fascinating talk. And just to say that the AIM team is very active in this space on an ongoing basis. We're actually currently developing the world's first target product profile for preeclampsia risk screening technologies. And on the screen, you'll find a QR code and a link to a survey that's now live, looking for the input of diverse stakeholders on that target product profile. All are welcome to complete that. It's currently available in English and will soon be launched in and Spanish and French in the very near future as well. So we encourage people to participate in that. Look, thank you so much, Cecile. Really cutting edge stuff, really exciting. I think the message is clear that we really need predictive and diagnostic technologies. This is an active space with 76 technologies and a range of approaches, but as Cecile says, multi-parameter testing seems to be the future. We'd now like to move to the next part of our webinar, where we're going to introduce our expert panelists. It is a real delight for me to introduce Koiwa Koilabi. She is the Executive Director of Action on Preeclampsia. Koiwa, if you've ever met her or heard her speak, she's an extraordinarily impassioned person. She's a social entrepreneur, an activist, and a community engagement specialist. She comes from a background in law and administration and management, but's founded the first activist patient organisation in Ghana that focuses on hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, which is APEC Ghana. It's really wonderful to have you with us here, Koiwa, to share your perspective and that of so many women in Ghana and internationally. Our other panelists today, just advance the slide for me, thanks, Anna. We're very delighted to have Professor Mushi Matia here. He's Professor and Head of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Groote Hospital, the University of Cape Town. Mushi himself is an esteemed obstetrician, gynecologist and researcher in pre-eclampsia and high-risk obstetrics. He holds a number of important positions both in his hospital and more broadly in the university and in South Africa, including a ministerial appointment as the chair of the National Health Research Committee. And his own research program has focused on molecular aspects of aberrant placentation, including disorders such as pre-eclampsia. And it's a real delight to have you here with us today, Mushi. Our final panelist is Dr. Alice Hurrell. And Alice is a trainee in obstetrics and gynecology based in London. She's at St Thomas Hospital. And Alice has a really critical role to play in today's discussion because she coordinated the PARROT-2 trial, which was a very large trial looking at the use of placental growth factor testing in this space of preventing preeclampsia-related outcomes. And her research work continues with a number of other NIHR grants in the space of improving outcomes for women and babies affected by preeclampsia. So thanks so much, Alice, and to all three panelists for joining us here today. I am going to invite our attendees today to use the Q&A function to post any questions to our panelists or indeed to Cecile as well. But I might just kick it off by asking Koiwa to speak first. And Koiwa, you're running an advocacy and an activist organisation on preeclampsia in Ghana. We're hearing a lot about the exciting technologies in this space, but you know, what is it that patients, that women and families want from this space, and you know, how do we channel that that desire when it comes to making improvements to health systems? Over to you.
Hello, greetings from Ghana. Can you hear me?
Hearing you well, yeah.
Okay, great. So my name is Koiwa, again, Executive Director of Action on Pre-eclampsia, a maternal health organization focused on advocacy on hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. The founding of APEC Ghana is inspired by my own story as a 4-time survivor of all the spectrums of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy, pre-eclampsia, eclampsia, and HELLP syndrome. I've had it all. Out of 4 pregnancies, I lost 3 babies. I have only 1 surviving child who is currently 10 years. And it was during the 3rd experience that in my quest to seek for some supports for myself, in my quest to sort of understand the disease, in my quest to really find out what I did wrong to have that much experience, was when I sort of, you know, went into research, and then I got in touch with some organizations outside Ghana, more like other patient advocacy organizations, and they supported me through my recovery. And I took inspiration from that to be able to found the organization APEC Ghana. And together, I did that together with other survivors as well, who are also all survivors of preeclampsia. Most of the main objectives we've been doing is providing education, both patients and both health practitioners. Also because our first pregnancy, we were ignorant, and so there was no information about it. And also we try to partner with researchers and also provide postpartum counseling to our women. One of the key things we do, or many things we do to fulfill this function, is community engagement. And as we do the community engagement, you go down there, you engage the community, you tell them sort of what this condition is. They also tell you what they expect. They also sort of try and ask you questions. Actually, we recently, we are in the process of this project where we finished the first phase of priority setting partnerships, where we're trying to identify the questions for areas of research for HTP, and we had to go to the community to administer survey and engage them what they think are the sort of high area questions that, you know, researchers should focus on. And really, a lot of the women just want to know, one, how do we prevent this? How do we prevent this condition that seems to be sort of dealing with us harshly in a way that is quite unpredictable? And so there are questions on, is it my diet that I should change? Is it my, something that they are taking, something that they are doing? So it's really a question of how do we prevent it? And then there is also the thing of, well, we wish there could be more education on it, because the thing is, Ghana runs on we do antenatal clinics, and so ideally, when pregnant women go to antenatal clinics on the scheduled dates, you expect that there's some education going on. But then our women are saying that, well, I didn't know much about this, and so then there's a question of how effective are these education going on at the antenatal clinic? How effective is the mode of communication for the women to be able to appreciate this kind of things, And then one of the things that also stand out to them is, well, when a woman will say, okay, I got diagnosed, and then I had to go and do all these lab tests, and there was so much economic cost related to it. And so, yes, I've had you diagnose me, but if that diagnosis is gonna make me do all these much tests and there's so much cost to it, then I'm a bit hesitant, I'm a bit reluctant. I'm probably gonna go back to my religious or social leaders and see how we can deal with this condition other than, what the medical personnel is asking me to, because of the economic burden of it. And so that is one of the things, even though we have an NHIS system that covers antenatal and pregnant women, it does so at the basic level with consultations. So when it comes to diagnosis, then it's more of an out-of-pocket expense, and that's where the problem is. And so then it becomes a complication in itself. And so these are some of the issues, that came up. And then some also want to know the role that their family can play, because sometimes they feel, is it genetic? Then so that they can be able to do something about it. And the issue of nutrition have also come in as a question. And then, of course, then there comes all these culture myths that is associated with our context. I mean, we are religious context, hate it or like it. We are religious people, culture, embedded ethics. So when they are seeing some of these signs, to them is a beautiful thing. If you have a rosy cheeks and a rosy edema, you're probably having a baby boy. And so it's that is what they hear. And so they take enthusiasm with that. But then when we go on to do these engagements and you engage them, then some of the people are like, oh, okay. So when I was all rounded in my field, I was getting sick. When I'm a bit beyond this way. So you draw the attention, we draw the attention of women as we do these engagements. Some of these myths, and these surrounding these signs and symptoms. And so this has been some of the experience with what we've been doing, and some of the feedback that we get with women, but a lot of people want to know how to prevent it, deal with the economics cost, and the fact that pre-eclampsia comes with an extra burden, even when it comes to medications. There's so much medications that come with it. I mean, being pregnant is enough with the basic medications we receive, but then there comes the aspirin, there comes the calcium, there comes all the other ones. And so compliance is really an issue. So they will start first day, second day, third day, and then they are off. And then they come to the antenatal and you ask them, and you can see that compliance is an issue. So then the question is, how do we also deal with that? How do we make the journey, the pre-eclamptic journey of somebody diagnosed of pre-eclampsia a bit more, reasonable? So my submission for now. Thank you.
Koiwa, thank you so much. I think so much there to digest. I mean, what I'm hearing is that accurate testing is needed, but the tests alone are insufficient, right? You've touched on issues of communication, cultural engagement, cost of diagnosis, cost of treatments, and what are we expecting of women? But I think the message is clear. We also have maybe promising technologies that can empower women. That these tests can in many ways help women to take ownership of their own health, and how do we help them to do that in the most effective way? I want to bring in Prof. Mushi here. Prof, you're working clinically in South Africa, but you also have a very active research program. As I understand it, in South Africa right now, there isn't a regular use of screening and diagnostic testing in the pre-eclampsia space, but I think Cecile's presentation makes us wonder, so what would happen if we were to bring these sort of technologies to the clinical coalface? What do you see as the implications for a health system in a setting like South Africa?
So thanks, Prof. Firstly to Concept Foundation, and to yourself, Bernard, to the fellow panelists and to the audience, and to Cecile for a wonderful talk. So I think you're quite right in terms of the utility, both in the screening capacity and the diagnostic capacity for preeclampsia. And firstly, before I directly answer your question, I believe that the impact that these tests would have is likely where the burden is highest in terms of maternal and perinatal morbidity and mortality. And so that's where the most impact will be realized. And that would both be continentally, including South Africa, but also in the southern parts of Asia, where the burden is high. So there is a role for these tests, and I think a number of things have to happen. I think the investments have to be appropriate to where the burden is, so that there is generation of local data. Because whilst there might be use of these screening, certainly the screening tests in the private sector, you remember that we've got the private sector that is driven by private insurance, and the NHI bill has just been legislated recently in South Africa. And you've got the public health care sector as well, where really that is overburdened and with very, very limited resources. And so so there's limited use of the test in the private sector. But what you really need is generation of continental, including South Africa, data that gives the confidence to say that, in fact, perhaps diagnostic thresholds and limits established elsewhere are also relevant on the continent in most LMICs. Now, specifically to your question that relates to utility within antenatal clinics. So just to give you a bit of perspective of where we are as a country from a health perspective, is that we are, I think as everywhere else in the world, really challenged by the fiscal environment, which is harsh. And so there are really budgetary limitations on the health sector. And what it does, whilst we are trying to re-engineer the healthcare system, so in other words, towards universal health access and universal health coverage, so that everybody, irrespective of socioeconomic background, is able to access good quality healthcare. So that's where contextually the country is. Now, what would introduction of these biomarkers entail? As I indicated, we are one of the burden areas. So what is lacking is early screening. And the screening strategy that we're using at the moment is historical. So it's really looking at maternal history in terms of previous hits of preeclampsia. So for example, if you are pre-gravid, which we know is one of the, in fact, a high-risk population in terms of morbidity and mortality, they are not being screened because it's their first pregnancy. So I think there's a lot that can be done, sorry, in terms of the instituting tools or technology that really allows you, firstly, to screen upstream of the pregnancy, so that within the limited healthcare resources, we are able to look after the correct patients. Right now, we're not. So, for example, the other burden is, if you look at our antenatal clinics, again, based on historical factors such as previous hit of preeclampsia, where we know the risk is only around 13 to 15% of another hit of preeclampsia subsequently. Most of those patients are not, although the risk is higher than the baseline population, their subsequent risk is actually of developing is much, so they've got a higher chance of not developing it than developing it. And so we look after patients who shouldn't be looked after, and that could be then looked after closer to where they live, in the clinics and so on. So the impact on this, you've asked the question both in the short term, is exactly that, is that you are able to tailor the kind of patients that the health system, given its limited nature, is able to look after by virtue of identifying those at highest risk much earlier in the pregnancy. And but also when you are uncertain, because we know the diagnosis of preeclampsia is based on I think Cecile touched on that in her presentation, proteinuria and hypertension. A lot of conditions can present with that. And therefore you need something much more specific as a point of care test to say, well, we are quite certain that you don't have it, and therefore we don't need to spend on hospitalization costs, etc. And in the long run, again, looking at those, because these biomarkers have also been shown for their prognostic nature in terms of who's likely to have both short-term and long-term outcomes. So the impact is likely to be highest where the burden of maternal mortality for placenta-mediated disease, including preeclampsia, preterm birth, growth restriction, etc., is highest. So I think, but we need to generate our own data to be able to be confident about the thresholds that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thanks, Mushi. That's really interesting. I mean, I was struck in Cecile's presentation, 76 technologies, 10 are late stage, but I think, as you point out, even those that may even be late stage or in the market, would still need to be independently validated in different populations, particularly if they've been developed in other settings or indeed in European or global north settings. And I think your point is well taken about, we're all working in very overstretched settings in the current economic environment. But even if good testing costs money, if we can show how it will save money, save resources, and certainly bring a lot of relief to women to know that they can, safely assume that their pregnancy is not high risk. I think that also brings with it significant cost advantages. So certainly a big question is the kind of downstream economic benefits of testing. I want to throw to Dr. Alice, and Alice, you're a really important person to come into this conversation because you've done a really significant trial in PARROT-2, and maybe you could briefly introduce that for colleagues who may not know it well. But do you feel that we are now at a point where pre-eclampsia predictives and diagnostics are really meeting the real world need, or do you still see us as having some way to go in terms of research and development?
Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you, and echoing Mushi's thanks to the Concept Foundation for the opportunity to be a panelist here today. And it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and I think is a really, really important topic. So thank you for highlighting it. And Koiwa, thank you for sharing your experience as well. Hugely important to hear that. Thank you. So the PARROT-2 trial was a randomized controlled trial looking at repeat placental growth factor testing. So it can't be talked about without talking about the first PARROT trial that was done in the UK, which looked at the value of that first test. And so the PARROT trial was looking at a placental growth factor test. PARROT-2 actually included the soluble flip PLGF ratio that many of us will know about as well. And so this first trial looked at randomizing women to receiving a one-off PLGF test, a revealed test that was incorporated into clinical care, and then other women were randomized to concealed testing so that we could look at test performance and how accurate that PLGF test is, but without that result being revealed into clinical care. And this was a really important trial that showed that PLGF based testing really helps us to make a faster diagnosis. So it halved the time it took clinicians to make a diagnosis of pre-eclampsia, and that then translated into downstream clinical benefit for mothers in terms of reduced severe adverse outcomes. So looking at a composite of really major adverse outcomes. So on the basis of that big trial, it was recommended in the UK that women presenting with suspected preeclampsia, so either picked up in antenatal clinic with high blood pressure or dipstick proteinuria, or women presenting with symptoms of preeclampsia, that they should have a one-off PLGF test to help risk stratify, so to help us much more accurately predict whether a woman would develop preeclampsia over the coming weeks and days. And really really important to point out that PLGF actually has much better test performance than any of the other commonly used tests when looking at trying to make a diagnosis of preeclampsia. So when you look at the area under the receiver operator curve, it's far higher significantly higher for PLGF compared to systolic or diastolic blood pressure or the blood test that we commonly use. So there are a number of different blood tests out there for looking at placental growth factor or the ratio soluble FLT over PLGF. So there are 4 currently recommended by NICE. Those are the Quidel PLGF test, which is meant to be a near patient test, but it's still done on plasma. There's then the Roche Diagnostics test on soluble FLT PLGF, and then the Revity soluble FLT and PLGF tests. And then recently, last year, recommended in America, approved by the FDA, is the Brahms Crypta test, soluble FLT PLGF test from Thermo Fisher. And so a number of different tests out there on the market. And so in the UK, my trial was conducted in the UK, and this showed we'd had a lot of strong element of kind of PPI and asking women with preeclampsia how they felt about the test. And from both a clinician and a woman's perspective, having that result, that first result, really makes a difference in terms of their degree of certainty of what's going to happen. So they perhaps come in with fairly severe hypertension, symptoms of preeclampsia, but with a normal PLGF test, then we know with a high degree of certainty, 98, 99%, that woman is not going to develop preeclampsia over the next couple of weeks. And so women can be safely reassured their hypertension managed if that's a component, but they can be discharged back to routine antenatal surveillance with a far lower risk of an adverse outcome for them or their baby. Whereas, if women have an abnormal or very abnormal result, that gives us a lot of information about the level of surveillance that is required in order to minimize those adverse outcomes. So good tests out there, but I would say you're absolutely spot on that we are far from having the perfect test. So many of these tests are still done by a large scale, extremely expensive laboratory analyzer. Tests need to go to the main hospital laboratory. Results might not be available immediately, which is again frustrating, adding that element of waiting. What we really need to move towards is trying to develop a whole blood point of care test with results immediately available and then far lower cost associated, so that this test can then be implemented in a low resource, high burden setting where we all know that the high burden of preeclampsia is in lower and middle income countries, and so we really need to look at it there. And I think, Mushy, your point is absolutely spot on about local generation of data. So we've recently been awarded a large NIHR grant to work in Zambia, Sierra Leone, India and Brazil. So quite varied settings, but settings that are very high burden, looking at, does this test make a difference and how does it make a difference? And also looking at the health economics, both from a hospital perspective, but also from the patient perspective as well. So exactly as you were saying, Koiwa.
Alice, thank you. That really helpful. A huge amount of useful detail. I'm getting a number of questions through the Q&A, and what I'd like to do now is actually kind of pose these questions to the panel, and maybe Cecile also can come on her camera so we can get her input if she's got some perspectives from the data. But there's obviously a huge amount of questions about cost and these health economics. And Alice, you just spoke to, the need to generate local evidence. I think even more than local accuracy and local validation, we also need local costs and local economic analyses as well. But can the panel speak to this point? Where are we in terms of cost? What sort of costs are these tests likely to incur? Who pays? And I think Koiwa posed a challenge to us. Is it a case of women having to reach into their own pockets and their own communities to pay for this, or are these costs that can be absorbed, into overstretched public systems? It'd be great to hear people's views on that.
I'm very happy to kick off, but would love to hear from the other panelists as well. So the tests that are currently recommended by NICE are really relatively expensive tests. I know much more detail about the NICE approved one than the FDA, but I suspect it's the same, and it has that huge cost of needing a large-scale laboratory analyzer. The Quidel PLGF test is slightly different in that it has just a benchtop analyzer. So I believe that device is around about £1,400, and you need a small benchtop centrifuge as well. And so in the NICE health economics analysis, they've quoted £70 per test. So really, a fairly expensive test. But although that is what's quoted, actually the costs may actually be higher because of the additional kind of QCs that are involved. The cost also for some of the laboratory analyzer tests, it depends on your testing frequency as well. And so the costs may be even higher than that. And I'm well aware that that is already an extremely expensive test, and compared to many other tests available. There are some companies that are very committed to having tests available that are at far reduced cost than that, and really with an LMIC setting in mind. But I think the exact cost of that are still slightly uncertain. One of the aspects that I think is really interesting that needs to be looked at in far more detailed health economic analysis is that because PLGF is potentially a much more accurate test than the other blood tests that we look at, liver function test, creatinine, uric acid, that if we work out through this PLGF test what a woman's risk of preeclampsia is, you may well not need the other tests. So if you get a PLGF test that is above 100, it's really normal. She's very unlikely to develop preeclampsia over the next 2 weeks. She doesn't need those other laboratory blood tests. So in the UK, we recommend weekly preeclampsia blood tests to look at renal function, liver function, but that's not needed with a normal PLGF. Whereas if the PLGF is very low, very abnormal, those are the women who would really benefit from laboratory testing, and particularly scan testing. So in the recent CRADLE-4 trial, which was looking at late preterm preeclampsia, 34 to 37 weeks, only 25% of women got a scan. As we know, scanning is ultrasound is something that's a very limited resource. So PLGF may well be really helpful at directing where the resources are best used, which women need to have the testing.
Thanks, Alice and Cecile. Mushi, please go ahead. Yeah.
So I was just going to add on to what Alice has said, that it's also quite important in terms of cost to look at overall cost. So the health economics and the health system savings are sort of that come upstream in terms of, again, tailoring care to the right kind of patients, but also the potential cost in terms of the usual laboratory. So somebody comes in, suspected preeclampsia, we do a gamut of tests instead of a singular test. So I think all those costs, and also the hotel costs associated with hospitalization for 3 days or so until you're confident, all those costs need to come in so that you're able to see, yes, they are expensive, and they are expensive because of the nature of the analyzers, as has already been pointed out for most of this test. But I know that there are currently efforts to go to a point of care direction where there are devices that are mobile that can be carried into the field to be able to assess PLGF in particular. So I just wanted to add to that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mushi. Increasingly, I'm thinking, from a good test that performs well from a health system perspective, should ultimately save the health system costs. The question is, how do health systems want to organise themselves in terms of who pays it at the point of care? Cecile, what can we say about cost based on the report? Obviously, these are experimental technologies, right? A lot of them are actually not in the market yet. Is that the case?
Yeah, price is not really included because it's really subject, even for products that are approved, it's really subject to a lot of variations depending on some contracts that can be signed, some special funding that goes into actually providing access. And for tests that are still in early, even late development, it's really hard to have a specific idea of how much they would cost. But what I can say to that is that when I was talking about point of care technologies, they're really like not relying on lab facilities, and that's what makes them really interesting also to not have to take that into account. And of course, we're not there yet at the point where the specificity of this test is enough, but there's definitely some efforts in that direction from the very early development on that. This idea of accessibility and not having to rely on a full lab to do these tests is already being considered.
That's great. Thank you. I've had another question in the Q&A, and it's about preconception testing. So pre-eclampsia, it's a disease of placental implantation. It's starting early in pregnancy, but I think we have a pretty good understanding now that, you know, there are women who are particularly predisposed, and Koiwa was very generous to share her, you know, personal experience with pre-eclampsia, how it affected her pregnancies and her family. But, you know, is there the possibility here that women can understand their likelihood of pre-eclampsia at a time when they're maybe planning or intending to get pregnant, rather than finding out later in the pregnancy? I don't know if any of the panelists want to speak to that, but Koiwa, I'd be particularly interested in your view from women's perspective about this interest in preconception testing. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's very interesting that you bring that up, and things that have come up in our discussions a lot. But in one of the struggles in our community and even with our women is the fact that preconception, it's not a concept that is fully accepted in our context. Like women and families don't take the time to prepare for birth. You know, the only time you maybe see a woman doing that is maybe they've had a previous experience of something, and so based on that, they are now more advised. But for a lot of first-time mothers, it's like you're expected to get pregnant right after. Why bother prepare for what and go what? So it's now that as part of our education with the communities, you know, we are trying to promote the idea for them to sort of accept that they have to, you know, plan their pregnancy, you know, go to the hospital before you get pregnant, talk about, you know, your family history, talk about how, you know, the prospects of the children. I mean, it's only through that conversations that they'll be able to sort of identify any risk factors to be able to even communicate it earlier. But I can tell you that this is a very huge struggle, because preconception is not something that is accepted. It hasn't yet gone down, you know, in this context.
It's a great point, Koiwa. Thank you. Other panelists, comments on this issue about preconception testing?
Yeah, perhaps if I could just come in there.
Please,
Josh. Yeah. So I fully agree with Koiwa. I think we don't use the interpregnancy opportunity very well, and part of that is immediate and sort of subsequent post natal care and intervention, and a part of that is preconception, because and a lot of that has to do with education, and I fully agree with what Koiwa is saying in terms of it's very important to send messages out there in terms of the importance of this, both in terms of spacing, but also in terms of modifiable risk factors, right? That can be addressed, such as BMI. So it's quite interesting that if you look at the risk factor, one of the BMI is a risk factor. For every increase in BMI unit, you get an equivalent, so the increase in the risk of preeclampsia. So there's this linear relationship that is there, that is very well documented by studies, but we don't exploit enough these opportunities and so on. And so I think that it's an opportunity, but also from a biological perspective. As you point out, we tend to screen much earlier on, but our understanding is now extending to the arena that, in fact, all the risks, and in fact most of the risk has to do with the decidual changes, even before implantation. And we know how well abnormal implantation relates to abnormal placentation and the downstream placenta-mediated disorders such as pre-eclampsia. So I think that we are not exploring enough, both in terms of how the health system is organized to involve communities and education and so on, but also the biological opportunity to look at what does that decidual look like pre-conception in terms of assessing that risk. We only assess it around 12 weeks, but a lot of those events have already been determined.
Yeah, I must say, reflecting on your comments, Mushi and Koi, was that maybe one is there's a lost opportunity here in terms of how we've been communicating or missing the opportunity to communicate to women about their preconception risk and the fact that that risk is modifiable. And I think Koi touches on your earlier comment about communication, about the need to engage people and meet them where they're at in that sense. And perhaps the other is that testing, while exciting, shouldn't distract us really from lots of other very important things that we could be doing right now, right? The point I think is well taken about BMI and other risk factors, which, you know, with armed with good information that people could do something about for themselves now. Alice, I want to bring you in. I've had a quite specific question about options in terms of testing. An attendee is interested in, you know, which biomarker test is really the better one in terms of accuracy and sensitivity of PLGF versus an SFLET PLGF ratio. Is there kind of a clear winner in that space? And I'm not even sure necessarily what the laboratory implications are. You know, is one a great deal harder than another?
So at the moment we have, so Quidel is the only tests PLGF, and that is the only one that's a validated, approved near patient test. So in some units around England, it would be done, you know, on labour ward with the kind of close to the patient and with a slightly more rapid result. Whereas at the moment, all of the tests that look at soluble FLIT are laboratory analyzers, and although it doesn't take all that much time, about 18 minutes on the analyzer, it takes a lot more time in terms of the logistics of getting it to the lab and things sometimes. But I think I think there's kind of lots of ongoing exciting work in that area. In terms of which one is best, so the COMPARE study looked at the Revity test, the Roche soluble FLIT PLGF test, and the Quidel, and really showed that the area under the curve is absolutely comparable between the three. So there is no front runner. They're slightly different assays, and so they have slightly different affinities to different isomers of PLGF. And depending on the thresholds that is selected, there's a slight kind of trade-off between sensitivity and specificity, but broadly they are all very, very similar tests at the moment.
Yeah, it's great, Alice.
So I think in terms of which test a unit implements, it very much depends on kind of unique different barriers and facilitators to the test. So for instance, if you don't have a Roche analyzer, then it would be very challenging to you know, to implement that test. But I think the novel point of care biomarker tests, both angiogenic biomarker tests, but also the metabolic one, the lamella glycosylated fibronectin that's mentioned in you mentioned, Cecile, in the report. These are kind of point of care tests that would have a far lower cost and would have huge kind of applicability to the whole world, but also still to high income settings. You know, there's many areas across the UK that still don't have testing available, and so, you know, across the whole world really.
No, thanks, Alice. I'm appreciating we're reaching the end of our hour together. I wanted to invite Koiwa to perhaps give us the last word before I just make a few closing remarks. And Koiwa, I'm always struck again and again in public health in so many areas, you know, the power of the public, right? The power of activists, consumers demanding change en masse and pressuring, you know, governments and other stakeholders to bring, you know, new interventions, new tests, new technologies to the bedside. I just wondered if you could reflect for us the role of consumer and activist organisations in the pre-eclampsia prediction and diagnosis space specifically, and maybe give us a few words that we can reflect on as we digest this report in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much. And once again, thanks Concept Foundation for holding this webinar. I think, as you rightly said, the voices of the people is very powerful. The voices of the patients, the voices of the end users are very powerful, because at the end of the day, all these, with the test and all these equipment and all these tools that come out at the end of the day is expected to be utilized in such a manner by the health system that the impact is felt, on the patients in terms of the care they receive, and of course the outcome to the pregnancy delivery. And so I think it's a great work being done, by the research community like yourself, and for us, the end users. We are very appreciative, because these kind of technologies is needed, as the years goes on, to be able to improve health outcomes. And it's just going back to the fact that, in as much as we do accept and welcome these kind of diagnoses, because if we are able to know earlier, that you're going to get pre-eclampsia, or this is your risk, then of course it makes it sort of not easier, but it helps with the management of the condition, along the pregnancy journey, or sort of prepares you mentally and physically of what to expect, during the pregnancy journey. So we are very grateful for that. But then comes, as I said, the economic cost. So we should factor all these in, where we can talk of cost sharing, because as I think Dr. Moshe said, it moves beyond just the diagnosis text. It's about even coming to the facility, the cost involved with the frequency of visits a pre-eclampsia patient has to come to the hospital, the frequency of the diagnosis they have to do. And so we need to definitely have that serious conversation on the health economics in respect to these diagnostic texts that are coming up, so that at the end of the day, it will actually be beneficial to us. And as a patients organization, we are truly grateful and willing to be part of this initiative, and how we can also come on board. And thank you once again, and we wish the team the best. Yeah.
Thanks, Koiwa. It's always uplifting to hear you speak from that perspective. And I just want to maybe bring this wonderful session to a close. I just want to mention that the Policy Cures research team's done a wonderful job pulling together this world-first pipeline. Then I must say, this is an absolute goldmine of information, not just for those who are working in the research space, but those who are interested in what the future of pre-eclampsia prediction and diagnosis looks like. And thank you, Cecile, and the whole PCR team for bringing that to light. That can only help us all. I want to thank very sincerely our wonderful panelists, Koiwa, Alice, Mushi, for giving us your time and your expertise. And I'm sure people can find you online should they have any questions of interest as well. This is a recorded session that'll be made online on YouTube via the Concept Foundation website in the very near future. Concept Foundation website has a number of research and development pipelines on major causes of morbidity and mortality for pregnant and postpartum women. And as I said earlier, this is one of a series of webinars where we're going through the state of the art in these various technical areas. So please do stay in touch with Concept and follow them on social media for future sessions. And we are planning our next webinar to come in the very near future. So my thanks to Anne, to Carolyn, and the Concept Foundation team. A final reminder just to please complete that survey on the new target product profile for preeclampsia risk screening. And we really appreciate you joining today. And please feel free to share this recording with colleagues working in the preeclampsia space internationally. And I think we all collectively share in this mission to try and improve preeclampsia prediction and diagnosis, but more importantly, empower women for their own health, for the health of their families and babies, for a better tomorrow. So with that, I will sign off and wish you all very well. Thank you very much.